All right, diving right in. Today, it's feminist moral psychology. Big topic, huge implications, especially, for anyone into philosophy. Because we're
Absolutely.
not just like floating around in the abstract.
Yeah.
It's about the nitty-gritty of how we make moral choices,
Yeah.
right? Our desires, responsibility, all that jazz,
Yeah.
especially with, power structures and how they play in.
Exactly. We're digging deep into some serious philosophical heavyweights, primarily the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on feminist moral psychology.
Solid source.
So we're going to extract those like core insights, where feminist perspectives kind of shake things up compared to, well, the usual suspects in moral philosophy. And of course, a biggie, how gender and power dynamics warp our moral landscapes.
Okay, I'm with you. So let's kick things off with moral motivation. Classic philosophical puzzle.
Mm.
What really drives us to do the right thing right? You got your Hobbes, self-interest all the way. Then Hume comes along, sympathy, benevolence, that kind of vibe. And obviously we can't forget Kant, reason, the big kahuna.
Now, for feminist philosophers, what immediately jumps out is this historical emphasis on reason over emotion. Like, emotion gets all tangled up with, like, feminine stereotypes, right? Seen as less reliable, flighty, all that. Whereas reason, that's the masculine domain, the ultimate yardstick for morality.
Right, almost like a hierarchy, right? Reason on top, emotions.
Yeah.
Well, not so much.
Exactly. And that raises a huge red flag because our whole understanding of moral motivation might be skewed, Like it's built on this foundation of gendered assumptions that we might not even be aware of.
I see where you're going. Kant's whole reason must conquer desire thing kind of implies emotions are just obstacles, right? And even Hobbes, with his self-interest focus, that's very much what traditionally masculine view of the public sphere, all about competition and individual gain.
Right. And that's where someone like Annette Baer comes in, who finds Hume way more compelling. She sees this strong connection between his emphasis on sympathy and what she considers like women's moral wisdom, like drawing on Carol Gilligan's work. Remember her?
Oh, yeah, the different moral orientations, right?
Yeah. Gilligan's care perspective. Women's narratives often prioritize relationships avoiding harm versus the more masculine justice orientation rules, abstract principles, all that. Bayer sees a strong link between Hume's sympathy and this care perspective. But, and this is crucial for us as philosophers, we got to acknowledge the huge debates swirling around Gilligan's work. Some critics, they worry about reinforcing stereotypes, question her methods, even wonder if differences are truly about gender or, social roles, upbringing, stuff like that.
Right. It's not a simple one-to-one mapping gender to moral orientation.
No, not at all. But this takes us to the ethic of care, a major, landmark in feminist thought. It elevates care, not just caring actions, but the whole motivation behind it as absolutely central to morality. And this perspective often draws on the intensely formative experience of mother-child relationships, right? And it directly challenges that traditional focus on, these abstract individuals in the public sphere interacting all impersonally.
Yeah, almost like an antidote to that hyper-individualistic view, right?
Totally. And that brings us to a really philosophically juicy point.
Oh.
The whole moral epistemology angle. Like Margaret Little argues, care isn't just some warm, fuzzy feeling. It's a fundamental capacity for even grasping the moral landscape. Like caring about someone. That gives you the sensitivity to notice those morally relevant details, to actually understand their experiences, to respect them as moral agents. Without care, you risk this abstract, detached understanding of morality. It's incomplete. It's like the ability to see what morality demands might actually hinge on our capacity to care.
Well, that's powerful. Care isn't just a nice bonus, it's foundational.
Exactly.
Well, hold on. Feminist thought isn't a monolith, right?
Yeah.
Enter Jean Hampton, and she's got some serious reservations about this sole focus on care.
Yeah, she raises a really crucial point. Can prioritizing care, exclusively actually backfire? Hampton looks at Gilligan's famous Amy case, and she worries that overemphasizing care might lead women to, constantly put others' needs before their own, and that can make them vulnerable, ripe for exploitation. She argues that self-interest has got to be in the mix, maybe even a contractarian framework, a la Hobbes, but also with that Kantian element of inherent human value, making sure everyone's interests are on the table. It's this really interesting tension, right, within feminist thought itself, balancing relationality with individual agency.
Absolutely. And this leads us right into another philosophical rabbit hole, one I bet you'll appreciate. The whole internalism-externalism debate, specifically about moral motivation. It's familiar territory for a philosopher, right? This question of is there a necessary link between our moral judgments and our actual drive to, walk the walk?
Yeah, let's break down the versions of internalism that feminist philosophers have really grappled with. So, agent internalism. This idea that if you genuinely have a moral obligation, you're inherently driven to fulfill it. Now, the feminist critique here is sharp. If someone's out there, perpetuating oppression, but they lack the motivation to stop, does that mean, according to agent internalism, they don't even have a real moral reason to stop? That seems, well, messed up, ethically speaking.
Yeah, it doesn't sit right.
Right. And then there's the other version of internalism. If a rational agent judges something morally right, they should be motivated to do it. And if they're not, well, that points to some kind of irrationality. The worry here, from a feminist perspective, is that this could unfairly label people in oppressed groups as irrational simply because, due to their social conditioning, they haven't connected that intellectual understanding of a moral reason, like the importance of self-respect, with the actual oomph to act on it. And that's where the social context becomes so crucial for understanding, the psychology of morality.
Nelson's work really shines here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He's got this idea that the link between moral belief and action isn't so cut and dry. It's more like a spectrum, heavily influenced by the moral norms of your social world.
Exactly. It's not the simplistic, you believe it, therefore you do it equation.
Right. So someone living in a sexist society might fully get that something's morally required, but still struggle to act accordingly. Those ingrained societal norms have that much pull.
Exactly. It's not about calling them irrational. It's about understanding that web of influences.
And man, Hill's deferential wife, that example really drives this home.
Yeah.
Here's someone who intellectually believes in equality, but still feels this deep pull to serve her husband's needs completely. Now, a strict internalist might say, well, she's irrational. She's not acting on her own belief and self-respect. But the feminist lens is like, hold on, look at the socialization she's been bombarded with. This isn't irrationality. It's the impact of patriarchy, shaping her motivations in ways that clash with her conscious beliefs.
Precisely. It highlights how social context can warp our motivational landscape, sometimes in ways that directly contradict our own stated beliefs.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, we got to talk about deformed desires. This is a big one, especially when we're thinking about how power structures can shape our wants and needs at a fundamental level.
Yeah, these are desires molded by unjust social conditions, like, say, patriarchy. And often, and this is the crazy part, they end up benefiting the dominant group, not the individual who holds them. For a philosopher who's all about autonomy and agency, this is huge.
It's like the system rigging the game even down to what we want.
Exactly. Think about it. The deferential wife, her ingrained desire for servility, or young women prioritizing relationships with powerful men over their own intellectual growth, or the overwhelming pressure to conform to these often harmful, unrealistic beauty standards. These aren't desires that spring from genuine self-interest or actually help someone flourish.
It's more like conforming to what the system expects, even if it hurts you.
Precisely. And the key markers here are: they're born within unjust conditions, they reinforce power imbalances, and they often involve this element of self-deception, like not fully grasping what's truly in your best interest. This throws a major wrench in the whole concept of autonomy.
Right. If our desires are shaped by oppressive forces, how can we claim our actions based on those desires are truly free?
Exactly. The more deformed our desires, the less we're acting from our authentic selves. We're basically puppets of the system.
This is where things get really interesting, right? Because you have thinkers like Christina Hoff Sommers and some evolutionary psychologists who basically reject this whole deformed desires thing. They say, nope, women's preferences are genuine. They reflect evolutionary strategies, like differences in parental investment and all that.
Right. They argue that observed differences between men and women are just that. Differences, not necessarily a sign of oppression or anything nefarious.
Just different strokes for different folks, as they say. But then you have someone like Wilson come along, and she offers a really interesting critique, drawing on, of all things, literature. She says novels often show women yearning for much more than just wealth or status.
Right. It's about deeper desires, for fulfilling relationships, for meaningful work, for creative expression, all those things that often get stifled or redirected because of limited opportunities and societal expectations. It's that sour grapes phenomenon, right? Convincing yourself you don't want something because you can't have it.
So the idea that women are just naturally content with their lot starts to crumble when you factor in all those constraints.
Exactly. It's not as simple as saying, well, they're getting what they want, so it must be their authentic preference.
Yeah, Aria Baber jumps into the ring with a totally different argument. She says, hey, the origin of a preference doesn't matter. Even if it's adaptive, even if it arose in a messed up situation, if satisfying that preference makes someone better off, that's what matters.
It's a utilitarian perspective, right? The end justifies the means, in a sense. She's challenging the assumption that choices made under duress are automatically invalid or uninformed.
So for her, even those adaptive preferences might just be individuals making the best of a bad situation, not a sign of damaged desires.
Right. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the radical feminist perspective, thinkers like Daly, Dworkin, McKinnon, and they often take a much stronger stance saying, look, under patriarchy, pretty much all of women's desires are deformed to some extent.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
It is. But even within that radical view, they do acknowledge that there are still non-deformed desires for basic well-being, for connection, for things that genuinely contribute to flourishing. So it's not like women are just mindless robots programmed by the patriarchy. It's more complex than that.
It's a mix of both, right? Deformed and non-deformed, all swirling together. And that's where Narayan's concept of bargainers with patriarchy comes in, offering a more nuanced view. She says women under patriarchy have this complex tapestry of desires, and they're actively trying to navigate it, making choices within those very real constraints.
Right. It's not about being completely powerless. It's about finding ways to exert agency within a limited set of options.
Like her example of Sufi Pirzada women choosing to veil, not necessarily because they've swallowed patriarchal ideology whole, but because they're strategically navigating a complex web of social, religious, and personal factors.
Precisely. And then you have Bruckner, who comes in with his defense of rational adaptive preferences. He argues that adapting your preferences can actually be a rational strategy as long as you're doing it reflectively and as long as it genuinely promotes your well-being. Like within a framework of just moral conditions, like Nussbaum's capabilities approach.
So it's not just about blindly conforming, it's about consciously choosing to adapt in a way that serves your own interests.
Exactly. The key is whether you're really making that adaptive preference your own, not just internalizing external pressures.
And then Westland adds another layer with her concept of procedural autonomy. She says autonomy isn't just about the content of your desires, but about your attitude towards them. Are you willing to critically examine them, to justify them through reasoned engagement?
It's about being able to say, these are my desires, and here's why I hold them.
So the deferential wife, for example, might lack autonomy not because of her deferential desires themselves, but because she might not be able to, or even willing to, offer a reasoned justification for why she always puts her husband first.
Exactly. It's about that capacity for self-reflection and reasoned deliberation.
Okay, now, Cater comes in with her own take on adaptive preferences. She's got this perfectionist definition where she connects subjective experience with more objective notions of human flourishing.
She sees adaptive preferences as those that clash with basic flourishing, that are formed in environments that are bad for well-being, and that can potentially change if the conditions change. And importantly, she doesn't automatically equate adaptive preferences with a lack of autonomy.
It's about looking at the context, right?
Yeah.
The social and political forces that shape those preferences.
Exactly. It's not about labeling individuals as inherently lacking agency. It's about understanding the pressures they're facing.
Now, all of this talk about deformed desires really ties in with Barkey's concept of psychological oppression. This is where those deformed desires aren't just individual quirks, they're part of this system of internalizing inferiority, of shaping the oppressed to act in ways that benefit the oppressor. It's like oppression working from the inside out.
Precisely. It's not just about external constraints, it's about the insidious ways in which power seeps into our inner lives, shaping our very desires.
Okay, so finally, let's tackle responsibility. This is a big one in moral philosophy, and feminist thinkers have really brought some fresh and challenging perspectives to the table.
Yeah, they make this crucial distinction between responsibility for systemic oppression, which is often diffuse and difficult to pin down, and responsibility for individual acts that are clearly wrong.
It's a tricky one, right? Like holding every member of a dominant group responsible just because they belong to that group feels too broad, potentially unfair.
Right, it's not about blanket blame. But on the flip side, letting everyone off the hook who doesn't have explicitly bad intentions ignores the ways in which oppression is often perpetuated unconsciously through seemingly small, everyday actions.
Like Lawrence points out, it's the cumulative effect of all those little acts that really upholds those systems of power.
Exactly. And Moody Adams really pushes back against the idea that "I didn't know" is a valid excuse. She talks about affected ignorance, this deliberate choice to not know, to remain willfully blind to the consequences of your actions. actions.
So it's not just about ignorance, it's about the choice to remain ignorant.
Precisely. And she emphasizes that cultures aren't static, they're constantly being shaped by individuals, so we have more responsibility than we might think.
But Isaacs adds some nuance here, right? She says, hold on, not all ignorance is created equal. Access to knowledge isn't always fair, and new moral understandings take time to spread.
It's about acknowledging those disparities and about recognizing that as moral knowledge becomes more widespread, the "I didn't know" excuse holds less and less water.
So it's a process, right? A gradual shift from the abnormal to the normal. Now, you also have thinkers like Zach and Superson who advocate for a much stricter view of responsibility, grounded in this idea of shared humanity.
They argue that privileged individuals have this fundamental responsibility to recognize and respect the equality and dignity of everyone, regardless of societal norms or biases. And while it might be hard to sort through all those ingrained oppressive norms, that doesn't negate the underlying responsibility.
So it's a higher bar, right? It's not just about following the rules, it's about actively challenging them when they're unjust.
Exactly. And then you throw implicit bias into the mix, and things get even more complicated. Saul describes how these unconscious biases can lead to real harm, even in people who consciously endorse equality.
Yeah, it's like this hidden layer operating beneath the surface, influencing our actions in ways we might not even realize.
And that raises all sorts of thorny questions about moral responsibility, like can you be held responsible for something you're not even aware of? Zhang offers this useful distinction between attributability responsibility, what you consciously endorse, and accountability responsibility, being held accountable for the consequences of your actions, regardless of your intent. It's a helpful framework for navigating this messy terrain.
Okay, so shifting focus a bit, perspective taking emerges as this really crucial element in feminist discussions of responsibility. Like Zach argues that people who perpetuate racism or sexism often lack this fundamental capacity to genuinely identify with those outside their privileged group.
Right, it's about being able to step into someone else's shoes, to see the world through their eyes. But the problem is, dominant groups often claim they just can't do that. They say, we can't truly understand the experiences of the oppressed.
And that raises that whole philosophical question of ought implies can, right? If you should do something, does that mean you can do it?
Exactly. And feminist thinkers have proposed all sorts of ways to cultivate this capacity for perspective taking. You have Fry's idea of disaffiliating from privilege, like actively stepping outside your comfortable whiteness.
Yeah.
And Ligona's concept of world traveling, really immersing yourself in the worlds of the oppressed, which requires shedding your preconceived notions.
And then there are the more traditional philosophical approaches, like using analogies, as Compson does, or sharing personal narratives, which is a cornerstone of feminist discourse. But then you have Thomas, who's more skeptical. She argues that privileged individuals might be so fundamentally different that they can never truly grasp the experiences of the oppressed. So she advocates for moral deference in certain situations.
It's an interesting challenge, right? Can we ever truly bridge that gap? Now, another important contribution from feminist thought is this concept of collective responsibility. May and Strickwerda apply it to sexual violence, arguing that men, as a group, bear some responsibility for the prevalence of rape.
So it's not just about individual perpetrators, it's about the broader culture that enables and perpetuates that violence.
Exactly. They talk about rape culture and the way male socialization often contributes to a climate where sexual violence is more likely. And they highlight the benefits men derive from patriarchy, even those who don't actively participate in violence.
It's a systemic issue, not just a collection of isolated incidents.
Precisely. Now, finally, we have this thorny issue of the responsibility of the oppressed themselves. This brings up questions like, can extreme social injustice mitigate responsibility for seemingly unrelated immoral acts? Like Minkiti's argument that social injustice can contribute to psychopathy is a really provocative example.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And then there's the even thornier question of whether the oppressed have a responsibility to resist their own oppression.
Right. Feminist thinkers like Hay and Cudd argue for such an obligation, but they acknowledge the very real dangers and limitations involved. It's about finding that balance between the need for resistance and the potential costs.
And Benson's self-worth condition is crucial here. She highlights how internalized oppression can erode someone's sense of moral agency, which could lessen their responsibility in certain situations.
It's a powerful insight into the psychological impact of oppression.
So wow, this has been a deep dive in every sense of the word. Feminist perspectives have really shaken up traditional moral philosophy, forcing us to rethink everything from motivation to desire to responsibility.
It's been a real mind bender.
It has. For our philosophically inclined listeners, this should provide some serious food for thought, new ways of looking at ethical issues, and the complexities of social injustice.
Absolutely. We've definitely encountered some surprises along the way, challenging those comfortable assumptions about how morality works.
And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question. Given all these different feminist perspectives on responsibility, how do we actually encourage moral action against systemic injustice without resorting to, like, simplistic blame or accidentally undermining individual agency? And how crucial is it to understand the psychology of both the privileged and the oppressed if we're going to build a more just world?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And it's one that deserves a lot more philosophical pondering even after we sign off here.
Sure.